CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Juliet Byrne. Our top stories. Ukraine claims it's countering Russian forces, pushing them back to the border north of Kharkiv.
Sweden will end decades of neutrality by joining the world's most powerful military alliance, but Russia warns there will be consequences.
China's economic activity slows as COVID lockdowns bite, sending ripples through global stock markets.
And a war of words that risks becoming a trade war. Boris Johnson's in Belfast to try and break a stalemate over trade rules for Northern Ireland post-Brexit.
Authorities in Ukraine have declared a new victory in the fight against Russia. The mayor of Kharkiv says troops defending the city have pushed Russian forces back to the border 50 kilometres to the north.
A video posted on the messaging app Telegram shows a small band of Ukrainian fighters celebrating at a border post. Analysts say, if true, the failure to capture Kharkiv represents a major setback for the Kremlin.
Let's talk to Associated Press reporter Kieran McQuillan in Lviv. Kieran, what can you tell us about these claims from Ukraine?
Yeah, Ukraine is saying that it's pushed the Russian forces back to the border around Kharkiv. The closest that border is about just around 30 kilometres away from the city of Kharkiv. It came under huge Russian attack at the very beginning of this invasion of this country just less than 3 months ago. But there are signs that the city has returned to normal. The city's mayor says that residents have started to return. And an Associated Press crew that's on site there in the city says that there's been no shelling for over a week in the city. Now, we have also seen debris and the roads to the Russian border littered by some of these Russian personnel carriers and tanks. They have been abandoned, they've been burnt out, some of them have obviously sustained some sort of damage. An Interior Ministry spokesman for the Ukrainians, Vadim Denishenko, says that the Russians are now destroying infrastructure and blowing up bridges as they retreat. That's to slow down the Ukrainian progress towards the border as they seem to pursue them out of the country. You mentioned in your introduction there this video which was posted on social media channels here in Ukraine last night. It shows a band of territorial defense soldiers erecting a makeshift border post on what they say is the Russian-Ukrainian frontier. It's coloured in the flag of the Ukrainian country, that blue and yellow. It's a symbolic gesture. A U.S. defense official has just spoken to the AP, on the condition of anonymity in Washington. He believes that Ukrainian troops have pushed Russian forces to between 1 and 4 kilometres of the Russian border.
Let's talk about the Azovstal steelworks, Kieran, because we're hearing of possible new developments for the fighters trapped there.
Yeah, in the last 2 hours, the Russian Defense Ministry has issued a statement. It says that there is now an agreement in place for some of those very injured Azovstal brigade members to be transported to a town in the Russian-held Donetsk area for medical treatment, urgent medical treatment. We've been hearing in the last couple of days that the Ukrainians have been negotiating through the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister with Russian officials to try and extract some of these 30 to 60 very, very seriously injured and medically immunized members of the Azov Brigade. They have been suffering from tuberculosis and gangrene. They've been living in this warren of underground tunnels under that vast metallurgical plant down there. Now, so-called humanitarian corridor will be organised to the town of Novoazovsk. It's in the Donetsk region. Now, there was no immediate word on whether the wounded would be considered prisoners of war. In the past, the Azov Brigade have said that this is a fight to the death and none of them would surrender. But there has been no immediate word yet from the Ukrainian side on whether or not these claims are true or not.
Kira McQuillan in Lviv, thank you for that update.
The apparent loss of Kharkiv could prove to be a major blow for Russia's military campaign. Ukraine's second-largest city was expected to fall to Russian control in the first few weeks of the war. It's raised questions over whether Russia may fail in its overall objectives and instead settle for a compromise. Well, let's talk to Jamie Shea, who's the former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary-General for Emerging Security Challenges. Welcome back to the programme, Jamie. So it looks like Ukraine's pushed Russia back to its border north of Kharkiv. Will this be seen as a big loss for the country? What does it mean?
Well, thanks first and foremost for having me back on the programme. It's certainly another setback for Russia because Kharkiv was is the second largest city of Ukraine. It's Russian-speaking. And if Putin's objective was to seize the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine and try to detach them and one day integrate them into Russia, then the failure to capture Kharkiv after the failure to capture the capital Kiev, of course, is a setback. But we've also been seeing for some time that the Russians have dramatically scaled down their ambitions in Ukraine. They're concentrating more on the south. They're trying to expand their bridgehead in the Donbass area, where Russian separatists have been helping them since 2014, and consolidating their hold over the Black Sea coast. And if they do succeed in totally capturing Mariupol, then they will have quite an extensive slice of Ukrainian territory, very important for Ukraine's economy, along that Black Sea coast. So yes, it's good news for Ukraine, but unfortunately the bare facts are still the bare facts, which that Russia is in control of about 21% of Ukraine's territory, about the size of Greece. And unfortunately, what Russia controls represents a lot of the agricultural production areas of Ukraine, its vital export ports on the Black Sea coast, and its mining and steel production in the Donbass. So if the Ukrainians want to push Russia all the way back out of their territory, they're still, unfortunately, got to have to do a lot of fighting.
But as you say, though, good news from Ukraine's point of view and a big step for forces which have been on the defensive for much of this war. So what tactics are Ukraine using that are clearly working for them?
Well, first of all, they are getting now the supplies of these modern heavy weapons from NATO countries. For example, the United States has just delivered 90 W-77 howitzers, which are long range, which are extremely accurate, ideal for destroying Russian tanker formations. And the Ukrainians have obviously been also getting a lot of very good tactical intelligence from the United States and other NATO countries. They're now getting the training to use those weapons well, particularly, for example, more modern drones, which are giving them good observation and the rest. So providing that the West is able to maintain those supplies over the next couple of weeks or even months, the Ukrainians are able to come out of their defensive positions, know what the Russians are up to in advance, and exploit, obviously, their knowledge of the terrain and the fact that clearly the Russians are still suffering from supply problems, which have bedeviled them since the beginning, and low morale among their troops. And we see, unfortunately, the Russians not really being able to win pitched battles, falling back on these sort of terror tactics of using missiles to bombard civilian areas and Ukrainian cities, and simply trying to wreck the country by destroying infrastructure as they retreat.
We've had confirmation in the last couple of hours that Sweden will join NATO along with Finland. There's talk from Russia of far-reaching consequences over that. What form would you see that taking? We've had a suggestion from Russian state television that nuclear weapons could be deployed.
Well, I think we have to distinguish between what these hot-headed commentators on Russia state TV say, and they are playing up, of course, the nuclear threat. But fortunately for us, in Russia, like anywhere else, TV presenters don't command nuclear weapons or send armies into battle. What we're seeing, I think, from the Russian regime is more reserved and more moderate, as it should be. When the Finnish president, Niinisto, spoke to Putin over the weekend to tell him that Finland was now going to send its application into NATO, Putin's reaction was very calm and very mild. What we're seeing from Russia is more sort of economic retaliation at the moment in terms of gas cut-offs to Finland. or more sort of cyber attacks, these kind of things, than any sort of build-up of Russian military forces on the borders with Finland and Sweden. And I would expect it to remain so. The more the Russians sort of threaten major consequences, the more they're going to drive Finland and Sweden, as they've done already, into the arms of NATO, and the more Putin will be seen to be suffering a strategic defeat when he can't prevent that from happening. So I expect the Russian regime, now that they know that Finland and Sweden are going to join NATO, to play this down and say that what they've really tried to do all along is prevent Ukraine joining NATO rather than Finland and Sweden.
Jamie, great to talk to you as always. Thank you for joining us. That's Jamie Shea, former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General.
Well, Jamie Shea was talking about Sweden and Finland's bid to join NATO, and Finland says a decision by Russia to cut electricity supplies won't have a major impact. There's speculation that the move was a response to Finland's plan to join NATO, although the supplier says it's down to unpaid bills.
Finland gets around 10% of its electricity from Russia, but there are fears a threatened cut in gas supplies could have a bigger impact. Our correspondent Michael Voss reports from Helsinki.
Finland's chemical industry is one of its biggest multi-billion-dollar export sectors. Right now, it's almost totally dependent on Russian gas. Around 3/4 of all this Nordic country's gas comes from Russia, which is threatening to cut off supplies unless Western companies pay in rubles. The country, though, has been preparing for the worst for a while.
Gas prices started escalating from last autumn, and the actors in the gas wholesale market, they realize something is happening with the Russian supply. We cannot trust the deliveries from Russia anymore, as we have been trusted them for several decades before. But something is happening. We should source from somewhere else.
Finland does have an alternative source of gas. There's an undersea pipeline from Estonia, about 80 kilometers away across the Gulf of Finland. It opened 2 years ago, but it's going to take time for it to make up for the loss of Russian gas. Finland is also planning to build a floating LNG, liquid natural gas terminal, where additional supplies can be shipped in from elsewhere. If Russia does cut off supplies, it'll affect industry more than the public. Very few homes use gas, and much of the heating is supplied centrally. In the capital, most Finns live in apartments. Lauri Heikkilä rents his and has no idea what he pays for heating.
This is how I heat my apartment. I don't have any boiler. The whole apartment doesn't have any boiler, or the building. It all comes from the district heat plant.
The cost is covered in the rent or management fee. Each district has its own heating plant, which pumps hot water into every building. Some of the plants do use gas, but can switch to coal or biomass. There's no shortage of wood in Finland for biofuels, and much of its electricity already comes from alternative sources such as nuclear power, hydroelectric and wind. But it's industry which remains heavily reliant on gas. Chemical is the largest, along with metal refining, paper, pulp and food processing. And while businesses are likely to feel the brunt of a Russian cut-off, the impact is likely to be passed on to consumers further down the line. Michael Voss, CGTN, Helsinki.
McDonald's says it is permanently leaving Russia after 30 years and will sell its 850 restaurants in the country. The fast food chain had already closed its outlets in March following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. McDonald's said owning a business in Russia was no longer tenable or consistent with its values.
Meanwhile, Renault is selling its stake in Russian car maker Avtovaz to a state-owned entity. Russian research and development automobile and engine will take ownership, while a Moscow factory will be controlled by the city government. The French car giant says it has the option of buying back the 67% stake within the next 6 years.
Airline Ryanair has reported a $360 million annual loss and warned that recovery will be hampered further by the ongoing COVID pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Boss Michael O'Leary said ticket prices could rise by as much as 9% this summer, and said the company hopes to return to reasonable profitability in the coming year.
Still ahead on CGTN. Disappointing data out of China stokes fears of a global economic slowdown.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to the Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Welcome back. French Prime Minister Jean Castex has resigned as President Emmanuel Macron reshuffles his cabinet.
The new Prime Minister for Macron's second term is expected to be announced within the next few hours. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Ryan Thompson, who is in Paris. Hi, Ryan. What's behind this reshuffle, then?
Hi there, Robin. Well, when you see the headlines come across the French news channels or the global news channels saying the French government has resigned, Jean Castex is no longer the prime minister, it can seem quite sudden, quite shocking. But in fact, this is something that traditionally happens every 2.5 years in France. If you remember, when Emmanuel Macron took office for his first term, there was a different prime minister, Edouard Philippe, and then he resigned after 2.5 years. Jean Castex was the man in charge to take up the job for the second half of his term, and ultimately now it is his time to step down and for a new prime minister to be named to really try and accomplish some of the goals that Emmanuel Macron has laid out for his second term in office. So though it may seem really surprising, this is tradition in French politics. We saw Jean Castex cross the city a little bit over 2 hours ago. He headed to the Élysée Palace where he met face-to-face with President Emmanuel Macron to deliver his letter of resignation to him, thanking him for his service. Emmanuel Macron, a very similar message as well, saying that it has been a pleasure to have Jean Castex lead the government over the last 2.5 years, really since July of 2020, right after France exited that first COVID lockdown. And it has been Mr. Castex who has really guided the country and led it through lockdown after lockdown, really navigating the ins and outs of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now we are waiting for that news from the government, expected in about 30 minutes to an hour's time, where we should get a picture of who the next prime minister will be. There are some hints being given on French television as different sources close to Emmanuel Macron and close to the Élysée give a sense of who that next person will be.
So, Ryan, do give us a clue of the runners and riders, but also what will their biggest challenges be in government?
Well, of course, they are navigating a lot of crises that is facing Emmanuel Macron in his second term. He's laid out a bold agenda of what he wants to get done, but this country is quite divided. And as we head into the legislative elections in just over 2 weeks' time, well, there's likely a chance that Emmanuel Macron will lose a degree of support of the seats that he holds in the National Assembly and in the Senate. And that is critical to taking his ideas from just that, ideas to actually policy that can aid and help the French people improve this country and really deliver on the campaign promises that Emmanuel Macron has said when he was on the campaign trail a little bit over a month ago. So really ensuring that that can be done is the responsibility of the Prime Minister in this country. It's someone to really look after the legislative priorities, and that's what we expect this next Prime Minister to really be, someone who is a close ally to Emmanuel Macron, who has worked hand in hand with him and has really checked all the boxes. Now, I mentioned French media suggesting what some of the names will be. I understand it will nearly certainly be Elizabeth Borne. She is currently the Minister for Labour in France and previously has been with Emmanuel Macron since the start of his first term, since the government was reshuffled the first time in 2020. Before that, she was the Minister for Ecology. So she's really a loyalist to Emmanuel Macron, somebody that he says himself checks all the boxes in terms of her qualifications. She's really been at the national government in the private sector, doing a number of things. At one point, she was a prefect, so she's worked outside of Paris in a regional government outside in different corners of the country. Some critique that she doesn't have enough experience at the local level, which is what Jean Castex really brought to the table in terms of his qualifications. But at this point, we understand, Robin, that it is nearly certain to be this woman when the French government convenes for a passing of power ceremony in about an hour's time.
OK, Ryan Thompson in Paris, thanks very much.
The European Union has slashed its economic growth forecast for this year to 2.7%, down from the 4% which it predicted only in February. Brussels has blamed the prospect of a drawn-out conflict between Russia and Ukraine and continuing disruption to energy supplies. Our correspondent Mark Webster's in Brussels for us. So, Mark, good to see you. Tell us a little bit more about this forecast.
Certainly, there were two headline figures in this update on the economy, neither of which is terribly positive for the future of the European Union's economic prospects. The first was, as you rightly say, the slashing of the growth prospect. Now, that's down from 4% to 2.7%. While that might seem so terrible after all, the fact is it means billions of euros which will not now go into the pockets of consumers. They will not end up on companies' balance sheets. And that's one half of the pinch on consumers in this region. The other side to it is inflation. Inflation is now expected to rise to 6.8% this year. That would be by far the highest since the Eurozone was created. And it will be 3.5% next year. Now, in the real world, what that means is that even though the European area has created millions of jobs in the last year, wages won't rise nearly as fast as inflation. So every time a consumer in the area fills up with petrol, buys a loaf of bread, they'll have the same amount of money, but obviously the price will have risen. Now, the Commissioner said, well, it'll be interesting to see the extent to which people draw on their savings. Sadly, for the millions who don't have any savings, the choice is far bleaker, far starker. They're either, if they can, borrow more money, which will end up with them deeper in debt, or they're far more likely they'll have to cut consumption. Now, that means the next 2 years are going to be really tough ones for millions in the European Union.
They are going to be tough years. So, looking ahead, what can European member states do to protect their economies while at the same time trying to phase out those potentially more economical Russian energy supplies?
Well, that is the nub of everything that's going on. And it's interesting, I can guarantee you that across the road in the Commission building behind me and across Europe, what they desperately look at is how they try to reduce their dependence on Russian energy. As things currently stand, 1/4 of all the energy consumed in the European Union is coming from Russia. Now, they think they can cut pretty quickly the coal and the oil, but gas remains a far bigger issue. So what was being discussed today, and the Commissioner said he had to come out with this, if you like, as the doomsday scenario, is that they had to look at what would happen if Russia, in retaliation for Western economic sanctions, decided to cut completely the supply of gas to the European Union. Now, that would be catastrophic for some countries, some of the biggest countries, including Germany, which is very dependent on Russian gas. So what he was saying is that he didn't think that was a likely scenario, not for the least reason, that Europe paid Russia more than $100 billion for energy supplies last year. So that would leave a massive hole in the Russian economy. But he also made it clear that while he thought it wouldn't happen, they had to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. Because if that were to be the case, and Russia did simply take that decision to cut all supplies to Europe, there would be a massive recession. And those figures that the Commissioner was coming out with would be meaningless because countries like Germany would be in full recession.
Oh, Mark Webster, arbiter of fantastic news, as usual. Mark Webster in Brussels, thank you. Well, unexpectedly weak Chinese data has added to fears of a global economic slowdown. The numbers show the striking economic toll of the continuing COVID-19 pandemic. Widening lockdowns led to a sharp slowdown in activity for the world's second largest economy. Let's take a look at some of the numbers. Retail sales, now that's a key gauge of consumer behaviour. They fell by 11.1% in April, and that was from a year ago. Much worse than March's figure, which was 3.5%, and that was a drop in itself, and really missing economists' expectations of a 6.1% fall. Industrial production, now that dropped by 2.9%, in contrast to expectations for actually a slight increase of 0.4%. China's jobless rate, now that rose to 6.1% in April, and that's the highest level since the peak of 6.2%. That's what we saw in the early part of the COVID-19 pandemic in February 2020. And China's property sales fell at their fastest pace in around 16 years, and that's as lockdowns further cooled demand, slumping, look at that, 46.6% from a year earlier, really sharply widening from the just over 26% fall which we saw in March. And I spoke to Ginny Yan, who's Chief China Analyst at ICBC Standard Bank.
I think when it comes to confidence and sentiment, certainly the Shanghai lockdown has really impacted nationwide in terms of all of the equity, fixed income, as well as property market sentiment. When it comes to consumers too, they're looking for the light at the end of the tunnel. And because Shanghai is a major city, particularly when it comes to consumption, that light of the tunnel is nowhere yet to be seen. Hence, the current mood on the ground still remains relatively bearish.
There are ramifications too, aren't there? Deep ones for global supply chains, aren't there?
Absolutely, and particularly as we're still living in a very uncertain environment with geopolitics and also inflationary outlook hampering central bank decisions, it is likely that China's uncertain growth trajectory is going to really play on market and consumer confidence. Supply chain disruptions also already impacting on the rest of the world, particularly China's largest trading partners. So across the European Union, the US, of course, across ASEAN as well, all of those are having logistical supply chain issues, particularly with those trading partners.
Ginny, the property sector slowdown is particularly striking, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the latest figures in major cities are showing that there is still very much a nosedive of property sales, investment, land sales. And that, particularly that land sales and investment, tells us that even going forward in a few months ahead, there is unlikely a turnaround in the property sector. The current mood on the ground is very counter what normally happens in this season, which is a return of activity in both construction, investment and sales in properties as we start to head into the summer months. But that yet is not happening in Q2. So current supportive measures, particularly the mortgage easing, is not going to have a significant impact on boosting sentiment and confidence in property purchases.
Let's talk about the outlook, because analysts seem quite pessimistic about China's medium-term growth prospects. What could change that?
Well, there are already plenty of supportive measures in place, particularly fiscal measures. So I'm talking about tax cuts, rounds of local government bond issuances to ensure that infrastructure investments will have multiplier effects across the economy. And heading into the 20th Party Congress this fall in the autumn, it is likely that relative stability in China compared to especially other major economies in the world will be a highlight in the latter or part of this year. So stability when it comes to growth outlook and also perhaps in terms of the labour market, we're seeing currently unemployment figures rise, but that is likely to start to stabilise. We're already seeing tentative signs that activity is resuming. So that is going to be a positive piece of news that may boost markets. But I think it's very, very difficult to re-stimulate confidence, particularly as the mood remains relatively fragile.
Well, that slowdown in China is obviously being watched closely around the world, including on Wall Street, where our correspondent John Terrett is waiting to talk to us. So, John, is China data impacting there?
Well, my way of putting it is to say that the economists of Wall Street are always very interested to see what the data coming out of China is, and they more than make note of it. It's something that is high on their agenda. As for the traders that you see on the trading floor when I'm there every day, I think their priority is the day-to-day sort of tick-tock of what's going on in the US economy and trying to make sure that their accounts end the day in the green, if not the day, the week or the month. But certainly I know that the economists here are rather pessimistic in the light of what we've just been hearing. And there were some significant underperformers in this data which has just come out. And of course, COVID is being blamed. And Shanghai, as we heard in that interview just now, is at the center of all of this, mainly because, of course, it is such a major port city. Now, I know you've given some of these numbers. I'll just quickly run through them again so that people can understand if they've just joined us. Retail sales in China down 11.1%, where a 6.1% decline had been anticipated by Reuters, the news agency, which did a poll on this. Industrial production down 2.9%, whereas a little increase had been anticipated, 0.4%. And the unemployment rate in 30 cities way above 6% now. That's an all-time high. And as you did in that interview, Juliet, there you were talking about property sales. Well, they are really taking a nosedive. And there's even talk, I will tell you here, on Wall Street, that China may, in parts of the economy, enter a recession. Although, of course, no one is formally talking about that in Beijing. And here, the sense is that maybe parts of the economy are in recession, or shall we put it this way, at least in recession for them, for China and the economy as it's been run over the last number of years. This comes, of course, as Shanghai is promising to try and get going again. On Sunday, they said they would begin allowing some restaurants to begin reopening slowly. And today, Monday, Shanghai has let it be known that they want to try and get that city back to normal by the middle of June, and that would tie into what we were just hearing about the 20th Party Congress coming up in the autumn. In the meantime, the Tesla Gigafactory in Shanghai has added a second shift today in order to get things back to normal there. This is a very important plant for Tesla. They make thousands of vehicles which go to the Chinese market and are also exported all over Asia as well. The markets here in New York have been up and down today after a strong finish on Friday. The Dow is down just a fraction at the moment, NASDAQ by 1/3 of 1%, and the S&P 500 by 1/3 of 1% as well. And that is because of growth worries. And that plays into everything we've been talking about regarding China. Juliet and Robin?
Well, John, on the topic of Tesla, its boss, Elon Musk, has been tweeting again on Twitter, hasn't he?
Yes, he sure has. Now, remember, on Friday, the big story was that he tweeted out that he was putting on hold the $44 billion takeover bid that he's managing for Twitter at $54.20 per share. And the reason for that is that Musk doubts what Twitter says about what they call the monetizable daily active users. Now, these are people who use the site every day and on whom Twitter thinks that it can make money. Now, Twitter says that 5% or less than 5% of those people are fake or spam users. Elon Musk doesn't believe that, which is why he put the purchase on hold on Friday. And then over the weekend, he tweeted again, this time to say that he thought, in his opinion, 90% of those monetizable daily active users may, in fact, be bots or robots. Now, this prompted a letter from the Twitter lawyers saying, look, you can't say that because of the non-disclosure agreement that we've all signed, because you're in the process of trying to take us over. This all plays into the hands of Truth Social, which is the new social website run by Donald Trump and run by Devin Nunes, a former congressman. They say, well, you know, Twitter is a total shell and you should come over to us. Truth Social is actually the #1 social media app on sites at the moment, although it's having trouble scaling up. And of course, I think that what this is really all about is, as I said on Friday, Elon Musk is trying to bring the price down. He's prepared already to pay $44 billion. I think, given everything that's going on, he wants to bring that price down sharply, and he will do it if it turns out that Twitter has not told the truth about those monetizable daily active users. Finally, on the political side of this story, of course, Elon Musk says that Donald Trump is welcome back on Twitter once he takes over in the next 5 months or so, and that makes, at the moment, Elon Musk the #1 target for people who really disagree with that, who you might characterize as the woke community, I think. Back to you.
So many twists and turns on this Twitter story. John Terrett in New York, thank you.
Still ahead, Russia's allies come together for a security meeting to discuss Ukraine. We're in Moscow.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the second year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and the bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Juliet Mann and me, Robin Dwyer. The headlines again. Ukraine claims it is countering Russian forces, pushing them back to the border north of Kharkiv.
Sweden will end decades of neutrality by joining the world's most powerful military alliance. But Russia warns there will be consequences.
And China's economic activity slows as COVID lockdowns bite, sending ripples through global stock markets.
An update for you on a story we were talking about earlier with our correspondent Ryan Thompson in Paris.
As expected, Labour Minister Elisabeth Borne has been confirmed by the Elysee Palace as France's next Prime Minister. She is the first woman to hold the position in 30 years.
Well, Russia has called the decision by Sweden and Finland to join NATO a grave mistake with far-reaching consequences. President Vladimir Putin has warned any military expansion of military infrastructure in the Nordic countries will provoke a reaction from Moscow.
The Swedish government has formally announced it will apply for NATO membership just a day after Finland confirmed its plans to join the alliance.
As a NATO member, Sweden would not only strengthen its own security,
but also contribute to enhanced security in the Baltic Sea region and for NATO as a whole. Today, the working group's report and its conclusions were discussed in the Swedish Parliament, and the support for a Swedish application for NATO membership was broadly affirmed. After the debate, the government of Sweden formally decided to apply for NATO membership.
Let's talk to our correspondent, Jim Stenman in Stockholm. Hello again, Jim. A historic moment for Sweden.
Yes, quite the extraordinary day here. Obviously, the ruling party, the Social Democrats, they did announce their decision yesterday that they do indeed want Sweden to join NATO. Today, there was a debate in Parliament. That debate was headed up by the Prime Minister, and she managed to get the backing of the Parliament in order to move ahead with NATO membership, which we understand, based on a press conference earlier today, could happen actually today, tomorrow, or even on Wednesday. We also managed to get some clarity around the fact that this will definitely happen in conjunction with Finland's application to join NATO as well. So clarity there that both of those applications will go in at the same time. There was also a press conference that was headed up by the Prime Minister, and she was joined by the leader of the largest party, the second largest party, so her opposition party, if you will. They held a joint press conference where they expressed, their common goal for Sweden to enter NATO in collaboration with Finland as well. So very interesting times, and we're seeing unity in a way that hasn't really been present in Swedish politics for a while.
An historic decision with Sweden's ruling party announcing what's likely to mark the end of decades of neutrality.
Our 200-year-long standing policy of military non-alignment has served Sweden well.
This as the Social Democrats come out supporting the country joining the world's most powerful military alliance, as neighboring Finland, which shares a 1,300-kilometer border with Russia, moves in the same direction, defying Moscow's threats of retaliation, as the Nordic country, which has been military non-aligned since the end of World War II, seemingly upends its policy of not provoking Moscow and expected to submit its NATO bid at the same time as Sweden.
We hope that the Parliament will confirm the decision to apply for NATO membership during the coming days.
On Tuesday, Finland's president will start a 2-day state visit to Sweden with a focus on regional security, including a busy day of meetings here at Parliament.
But while Sweden and Finland appear to be moving in the same direction and at the same speed, NATO member Turkey has signaled it could veto their admission over a perceived support for the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, which Ankara considers to be a terrorist organization, something that could require some concessions by Sweden.
No matter what happens next, Sweden's decision to join NATO is a monumental one that's not just likely to change how it engages with the rest of the world, but also how it views itself as a country.
Sweden always tries to be neutral, but it never really is neutral.
It went very fast.
Our hand was forced.
In my opinion, it's not a good decision.
If we are in NATO, it feels like we have big guys behind us.
Other Scandinavian countries are peaceful countries. They're part of NATO and they're able to make that equation work, so why can't we?
Yeah, so those are just some of the reflections that we managed to get by speaking to people here on the streets of Stockholm as we wait for that formal NATO application to go in the next couple of days.
Jim Stenman in Stockholm. Thank you.
Russia's president has been holding a security meeting with allies about the conflict in Ukraine. Leaders of the former Soviet states have attended the talks in Moscow.
Among them is Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko, who claimed that sanctions against his country could have been avoided if the group had acted earlier.
Well, our correspondent Julia Chapman is in Moscow, and a reminder that reporters in Russia are working under strict media laws that restrict what they can say. Julia, what was said at this meeting?
Well, the CSTO is effectively Russia's answer to NATO. It's a military bloc made up of 6 former Soviet countries, and their leaders were meeting in person for the first time since November 2019 at a very significant moment in regional security as tensions are growing between Russia and the West. And indeed, there was a lot of talk about what kind of a response would be offered to the so-called unfriendly states, Russia's newest byword for the West. President Vladimir Putin spoke about the decision by Finland and Sweden to join NATO. He said that Russia has no problem with those countries and that this decision does not pose an immediate threat to Russia. But he did say that if there is later NATO military infrastructure on their territory, then that will elicit a response from Moscow, although he didn't specify what kind. Certainly, we've also been hearing from Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarusian president and an ally of President Vladimir Putin. He called on the CSTO members to show a united stance against the West, and he said if there had been one a few months ago, then Belarus might have avoided some of the pain of sanctions that it has been met with, as well as Russia. There has not been any suggestion so far that the CSTO could get involved in Ukraine, although Russia has talked at length about how it sees that it is at threat from Ukrainian forces. But certainly Russia did launch part of its military operation from Belarusian territory, and the growing relationship with the CSTO members in regards to Ukraine will be watched very closely.
And Julia, we're also hearing today about more global companies pulling out of Russia at considerable cost to themselves.
Indeed, we are. Two very significant announcements today. One, that McDonald's is looking for local buyers here in Russia for its Russian assets. It had suspended operations as early as March. It has still been paying its employees since then, but it has not been operating here in Russia. Now it has announced the decision to leave the market altogether. It expects a loss of about $1 billion US. We also heard today from Renault, the French car maker and one of the automotive companies that is most exposed to Russia. It makes about 10% of its sales here in Russia, and it has done for recent years. But now it has confirmed that it has sold its assets to Russian state entities, effectively becoming the first Western company to have its assets nationalized. It says that it is taking this decision for the benefit of its 45,000 employees, and it is expected that it will lose about $2.3 billion US in this deal. So certainly a very strong signal today that Western companies no longer see any kind of future here in Russia.
Julia Chapman in Moscow, many thanks.
Still ahead here on CGTN, protests as UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson visits Belfast to try and break a political stalemate on post-Brexit trade rules for Northern Ireland.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tanks here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas. So it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
It's the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the front line. Within clear view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is in Northern Ireland to try and sort out a trade crisis that's causing a political stalemate.
The Democratic Unionist Party is blocking the formation of a government in the Regional Assembly in protest at trade rules brought in when the UK left the European Union. And our correspondent Guy Henderson is in Westminster. Guy, what does Boris Johnson hope to achieve with this visit?
Well, if his plan was to try and unlock this state of political paralysis in Northern Ireland, it doesn't appear to be working, at least not at the moment. Northern Ireland is currently in a state where it has a caretaker government at the moment. So a few weeks ago in regional elections, Sinn Féin, a nationalist party that ultimately wants Northern Ireland to leave the UK and reunite with Ireland, became the biggest party in the regional Stormont Assembly for the first time. Then the now second biggest party, the Democratic Unionists, which of course want to stay as part of the United Kingdom, want Northern Ireland to stay in the UK, blocked any serious conversation about forming a power-sharing deal with the nationalists, saying that it first wanted a key part of the BREXIT deal signed between Britain and the European Union to be scrapped, specifically the bit which maintains an open border between Ireland and Northern Ireland and instead creates an EU single market customs border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. Now, Boris Johnson has been meeting with political leaders in Belfast on Monday afternoon. This is where they stand on things at the moment.
I'm sorry to report that we've had no straight answers really from the British Prime Minister, except a confirmation of what we already knew, which is that in fact this impasse is entirely coordinated between themselves and the DUP. And if the DUP are acting shamefully in holding back government, well then the British government is behaving even more shamefully in our view.
The idea that the Prime Minister is taking sides is for the ferries. The Prime Minister is here because it's his job to protect Northern Ireland. It is his job to ensure that we have the right to trade freely within our own country. That's his role as Prime Minister.
So it now looks as though Prime Minister Johnson will return to London on Tuesday. He'll convene, we think, a meeting of his key cabinet ministers who are, we think, expected to approve moving forward with draft legislation which could potentially give the UK the right to override that part of the Brexit deal. Now, that is obviously going to make EU member states who had negotiated that deal in the first place extremely uncomfortable. We may see some sort of retaliation. Not expected to be a suspension of the trade deal itself. I mean, passing this legislation for starters, it would still take several months. But what it's thought that one possibility is that Brussels may decide to relaunch legal action about what it says is a lack of enforcement along that customs border in the Irish Sea.
Guy Henderson in Westminster, thank you.
Lebanon's ruling Hezbollah party could be about to lose its working majority after Sunday's general election. The result is expected within hours. Analysts say it could leave parliament more divided and fragmented. Our correspondent Priyanka Navani reports from Beirut.
Results continue to pour in from Lebanon's Sunday parliamentary elections, wherein voters hit the polls for the first time since 2018. Now, Lebanon has been mired in an economic crisis for years, so it was change that people wanted, and indeed, it seems that's change that people are going to get, despite the fact that voter turnout seems to be at least 5% less than it was in 2018. Now, we're not expecting any official results until at least nighttime, but what we do know is that Hezbollah and its allies appear to be losing important seats across the country, including in its stronghold in the south. The president's Future Patriotic Movement also appears to be losing its status as the largest Christian majority bloc in parliament, going from 18 seats in 2018 to what appear to be 16 seats now. Making up for those losses is the Christian right-wing party, the Lebanese Forces, that has gained at least 5 seats in parliament. Independent candidates also flipping seats across the country in what appear to be a win for the revolutionary movement that has been growing since 2019. Now, we don't know exactly yet who will maintain the majority in parliament, but what we do know is that this parliament is definitely going to look a lot different than it ever has. I'm Priyanka Navani for CGTN in Metin.
The DPRK has mobilised its military to help distribute COVID medicine as the country fights its first confirmed outbreak. State media showed leader Kim Jong-un visiting pharmacies in Pyongyang after saying that drugs were not reaching people fast enough. The country's reported more than 1.2 million people having what it calls fever symptoms. The DPRK currently has no COVID vaccine programme.
Shanghai has set out plans to return to normal from the beginning of June as COVID cases there decline. After more than 7 weeks of lockdown, the Chinese city is gradually reopening malls, supermarkets, restaurants and other businesses. China reported over 1,100 infections on Monday, most of them in Shanghai. Almost all were cases without symptoms.
Hassan Sheikh Mohammed has become Somalia's president for a second time. He won a vote by lawmakers, which was held amid heightened security. Blasts were heard at Mogadishu airport ahead of the vote. Mohammed faces a number of severe challenges, including tackling drought, hunger and a continuing civil war.
Guangdong province in China is a major centre for garment manufacturing. Around a fifth of all the clothes produced in China last year were made there.
But outbreaks of COVID-19 have taken their toll. Our correspondent Sao Chufeng reports.
接到的外贸订单比疫情之前少了一半，然后相对而言呢，就是人员也比之前少了一半，现在就仅剩50多个人。
His nickname is Brother Plush. He's been manufacturing clothes since 2014. Most of his products are sold overseas, but since the pandemic began over 2 years ago, disruptions in the supply chain have shrunk his customer base.
然后就是那个物流成本。
One of the reasons is that my foreign clients don't actually make much money anymore. The clothing industry itself is not a highly profitable industry. Foreign businesses mainly depend on the exchange rate difference to make money. But now the logistics costs are too high. After the pandemic, maritime shipping prices have risen a lot, and so is air freight. So they can't really make money.
Brother Plush isn't the only one suffering. The Guangdong Association of Garments and Garment Article Industry says spring is the peak season for clothing and textile export. But this hasn't happened due to the fresh coronavirus outbreaks within the southern Chinese province. Guangdong's export of clothing and clothing accessories in the first quarter of 2022 was around $6.3 billion, down 2.3% from a year ago.
Although foreign trade in Guangdong's clothing manufacturing industry has been hit due to the pandemic, business associations and government organizations have come up with policies and measures to ensure international trade within this sector.
Our association and other organizations have jointly launched efforts such as the Digital Collaborative Innovation Center and Guangdong Fashion Week, which provide opportunities for business collaboration and a platform for display. The state has introduced a number of policies to help foreign trade enterprises. For instance, the Guangdong provincial government has invested more than 3 billion yuan to promote consumption and help enterprises.
Guan Yong is urging companies to ensure the quality of its products and utilize digital marketing to enhance trade with their foreign clients during the pandemic. He's also confident that along with the implementation of the dual circulation strategy, more international opportunities will be created for Guangdong's clothing industry in the long run. Cao Chufeng, CGTN, Guangdong Province.
And stargazers have been treated to a rare lunar event, a super blood moon seen here above the Spanish coastal city of Almeria.
Its red colour comes from a lunar eclipse when the moon falls into the Earth's shadow. And separately, the blood moon coincided with a supermoon event, which happens when the planet's orbit brings it closest to Earth.
Our headlines again. Ukraine claims it is countering Russian forces, pushing them back to the border north of Kharkiv. A video posted on the messaging app Telegram shows a small band of Ukrainian fighters celebrating at a border post.
Sweden has joined neighbouring Finland in deciding to end decades of neutrality and apply to join the NATO military alliance. However, Russia is warning there will be consequences and described the move as a grave mistake.
And China's economic activity slows as COVID lockdowns bite, sending ripples through global stock markets. The jobless rate rose to just over 6% in April, the highest level since the peak of the pandemic in February 2020.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We will see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.